I was standing in my kitchen when the phone rang. It was my daughter, Rebecca. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask about my eye. She said, "Dad, we need to talk about your retirement fund." I had gone blind in my right eye 4 months earlier, a detached retina. The doctors tried to save it, but the damage was too severe. I was 58 years old, still working full-time as a warehouse supervisor, and I had to relearn how to drive, how to judge distances, how to move through the world with half my vision gone. When it happened, I called my kids. I have 3 of them. Rebecca is 34, married, works in marketing. Daniel is 31, engaged, some kind of consultant. And Sophie is 27, still figuring things out, she says. I raised them by myself after their mother left when Sophie was 6. I worked 2 jobs for years. I put them through college. I never asked them for anything. But when I went blind, I needed help. Not much, just enough to cover the gap between my short-term disability payments and my mortgage while I recovered from the surgery. The total I needed was $5,200. I would have it back to them within 3 months, as soon as I returned to work. I called Rebecca first. She said, "Dad, we're saving for a house. I just can't right now." I called Daniel. He said, "I'm stretched thin with the wedding. Maybe ask Rebecca?" I called Sophie. She said, "Dad, you know I don't have that kind of money." I didn't push. I took out a small personal loan at a rate I couldn't afford, and I made it work. I went back to work early, before the doctor wanted me to, because I had no choice. My depth perception was gone. I tripped over pallets. I misjudged the height of shelves. I was exhausted all the time, but I paid the loan off in 4 months. I never brought it up with them again. Now Rebecca was calling me about my retirement fund. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, "What about it?" She said, "We've been talking, the 3 of us. And we think it makes sense for you to help us out now, while you still can. You're getting older, Dad. You don't need all that money sitting there. We could use it now." I said, "Use it for what?" She said, "Daniel's wedding is expensive. I told you, we're looking at houses. Sophie's trying to start a business. You've always said you wanted to help us succeed." I asked, "How much are we talking about?" She paused. Then she said, "We were thinking 80,000, split 3 ways. It's not like you'd be broke. You'd still have plenty left." I didn't say anything for a long time. She filled the silence. "Dad, you're always saying family comes first. This is what family does. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking you to invest in your children's futures." I said, "I'll think about it." She said, "Don't take too long. Daniel's wedding is in 6 months." I hung up. I sat there in my kitchen, looking out the window with my one working eye, and I thought about the $5,000. I thought about how none of them had come to see me in the hospital, how none of them had called to check on me after the surgery, how Rebecca had sent a text message, how Daniel had left a voicemail, how Sophie had promised to visit and never did. I thought about $80,000, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. Michelle stayed home with the kids when they were small, then went back to work part-time at a dentist's office. When Sophie was 6, Michelle told me she wasn't happy. She said she felt trapped. She said she needed to figure out who she was. 2 weeks later, she moved in with a man she met at a conference. She sent divorce papers through a lawyer. She didn't ask for custody. She said the kids would be better off with stability, and I could provide that better than she could. I didn't fight her. I signed the papers. She moved to another state. She sent birthday cards for a few years. Then she stopped. The kids don't talk about her much. When they were younger, they'd ask where she was, why she left. I never badmouthed her. I told them their mother loved them, but had to figure some things out. I told them it wasn't their fault. Rebecca stopped asking about her when she was 12. Daniel stopped when he was 10. Sophie kept asking until she was 14, and then one day she just stopped. She never mentioned Michelle again. I raised them alone. I worked my logistics job during the day and picked up weekend shifts doing inventory for a retail chain. I made their lunches. I helped with homework. I drove them to soccer, to piano, to debate club. I sat in folding chairs at every school event. I was the only dad at most of the PTA meetings. The other parents were polite, but I could tell they felt sorry for me. The single dad, the one who showed up to bake sales with store-bought cookies, the one who forgot about picture day until Rebecca came home crying because all the other kids looked nice and she was wearing a stained t-shirt. I tried my best. I really did. When Rebecca was in high school, she told me she wanted to go to a private college, a good one. I looked at the tuition and I almost laughed. There was no way I could afford it. But she showed me her grades, her test scores, her essays. She said, "Dad, this is my dream school." I made it happen. I took out loans. I worked overtime every week. I picked up extra shifts on holidays. I stopped going out. I stopped buying anything that wasn't essential. I wore the same 3 pairs of pants for 5 years. Rebecca got into her dream school. She cried when she opened the acceptance letter. She hugged me and said, "Thank you, Dad. I'm going to make you so proud." And she did. She graduated with honors. She got a good job right out of college. She moved to the city, got an apartment, started building her life. When Daniel was in college, he wanted to study abroad for a semester. He came to me with brochures, with program descriptions, with excitement in his eyes. He said, "Dad, this could change my life." I looked at the cost. It was more than I'd planned for, more than I should have spent. But I looked at Daniel's face, and I couldn't say no. I made it happen. I worked extra hours. I cut back on everything. I ate rice and beans for months. I stopped going to the dentist because I couldn't afford the copay. Daniel went to Europe. He sent me postcards. He called me from cafes in Paris, from hostels in Barcelona. He came back different, more confident, more worldly. He said, "Dad, thank you. That was the best experience of my life." I was proud. I was tired, but I was proud. When Sophie struggled to find her direction, I supported her. She changed her major 3 times. She went from nursing to art history to business management. Each time she'd come to me and say, "Dad, I think I found it. I think this is what I'm supposed to do." And each time I'd say, "Okay, sweetheart, let's make it work." I paid for 2 years of community college, then another 2 years when she transferred to a state school. I paid for textbook, for supplies, for the laptop she needed, for the car repairs when her transmission died. I never complained. I told her to take her time, figure out what she loved. I told her I believed in her. I never remarried. I dated a little, but nothing serious. There was a woman named Linda I saw for about 8 months when Sophie was in high school. She was kind. She was patient with my schedule. But one night she said, "You know, you talk about your kids a lot, but you never talk about us." I didn't know what to say. She was right. My kids were my life. They were all I thought about, all I planned for. I couldn't imagine making room for someone else. Linda and I broke up a month later. She said she needed someone who could prioritize her. I told her I understood. I told myself the kids needed stability, and they did. But the truth is, I also didn't want to risk bringing someone into their lives who might leave again. I wanted them to know that I wasn't going anywhere, that I would always be there. By the time Sophie graduated, I was 54. My hair was mostly gray. My back hurt most mornings. I had some money saved for retirement, but not as much as I should have. I'd used a lot of it to make sure they didn't graduate with debt. I told myself it was worth it. I told myself they'd remember. I told myself that when I was old, when I needed help, they'd be there for me the way I'd been there for them. They did remember. For a while. Rebecca got married 3 years ago. I paid for half the wedding. She didn't ask me to. I offered. I wanted her to have the day she dreamed about. She cried when I walked her down the aisle. She told me I was the best father she could have asked for. She introduced me to her friends, to her husband's family. She said, "This is my dad. He did everything for us." I felt proud. I felt like all the sacrifice had been worth it. Daniel got engaged last year. He told me he wanted to keep it small, manageable. He said, "Dad, you've done enough. We've got this." I was relieved. I thought maybe I could finally start saving again, start thinking about my own future. Sophie moved back home for 8 months after college. I didn't charge her rent. I told her to save her money, get on her feet. She did, eventually. She moved out, got a job in graphic design, then quit after 6 months to try freelancing. She said she wanted to be her own boss. She said the corporate world was crushing her soul. I told her I believed in her. I gave her $2,000 to help her get started. I told her it was a gift, not a loan. I thought I'd done everything right. I thought I'd raised good kids, kids who would grow into good adults, kids who would remember what I'd done for them. Then I went blind in one eye, and I found out what I was worth to them. I didn't want to bother anyone. The doctor examined me and said, "You have a detached retina. We need to operate immediately, or you'll lose your vision in that eye permanently." They did the surgery that night. When I woke up, my eye was bandaged, and a nurse told me I'd need to stay face down for 2 weeks to help the retina reattach. Face down, 24 hours a day, except for bathroom breaks. I was alone in the hospital room. I called Rebecca and told her what happened. She said, "Oh my God, Dad, that's terrible. Do you need anything?" I said, "I just wanted to let you know." She said, "Okay. Well, keep me updated. I'll try to come visit soon." She didn't visit. I called Daniel. He answered on the 4th ring. I could hear people talking in the background. He said, "Hey, Dad, what's up?" I told him about the surgery. He said, "Wow, that's scary. Are you okay?" I said, "I think so. They say I have to stay face down for 2 weeks." He said, "That sounds awful. Listen, I'm actually in a meeting right now. Can I call you back?" I said, "Sure." He didn't call back for 3 days. Sophie answered when I called her. She was crying before I even finished explaining. She said, "Dad, that's horrible. I'm so sorry. I'll come see you." I said, "You don't have to." She said, "No, I want to. I'll be there tomorrow." She didn't come. A week later, she sent a text. "So sorry I haven't made it yet. Work has been crazy. How are you feeling?" I went home after 4 days in the hospital. I spent 2 weeks lying face down on a massage chair I rented. I ate my meals bent over. I slept with my face in a special pillow. I felt like an animal. None of my kids came to see me. Rebecca sent flowers with a card that said, "Thinking of you, Dad." Daniel sent a text every few days asking how I was doing. Sophie called once, talked for 5 minutes, then said she had to go. When I went back to the doctor for my follow-up, he told me the retina hadn't reattached properly. He said, "I'm sorry, we did everything we could, but you're not going to regain vision in that eye." I sat in the exam room after he left, and I cried. I was 58 years old, and I was never going to see out of my right eye again. I called Rebecca from the parking lot. She didn't answer. I left a voicemail. She texted back 2 hours later. "So sorry to hear that, Dad. Let me know if you need anything." I never asked for anything. What was the point? But then, 2 months later, my short-term disability payments ran out, and I realized I couldn't make my mortgage payment. I was still recovering. My doctor hadn't cleared me to return to work. I had no choice. That's when I asked them for the $5,200, and that's when I learned the truth. I was extra careful around the forklifts. I asked the younger guys to help me with the high shelves because I couldn't judge the distance anymore. They were good about it. They didn't make me feel broken. They just helped. But at night, alone in my house, I felt broken. I felt like I'd failed somehow, like I'd raised my kids wrong, like I'd loved them too much, or not enough, or in the wrong way. I kept thinking about Rebecca's words. "You're getting older, Dad. You don't need all that money sitting there." As if my life was already over. As if I was just supposed to hand over everything I'd worked for and then, what? Wait to die? Move into their basement when I couldn't take care of myself anymore? I wondered if they'd even let me do that. Then Daniel called. He was cheerful. He asked how I was feeling, how work was going. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Then he said, "So, Rebecca mentioned she talked to you." I said, "She did." He said, "I just want you to know, Dad, this isn't about us being greedy. We're not asking you to give us everything. We just think it makes sense. You've worked so hard your whole life. Don't you want to see us benefit from that while you're still around to enjoy it?" I said, "I'm 58, Daniel. I'm not dying." He laughed, but it sounded forced. I know, I just mean, you've always been so generous. This is just another way you can help us build our lives. You'd be investing in our futures. In your grandkids' futures." I didn't have any grandkids yet. Rebecca and her husband weren't ready. Daniel wasn't even married yet. Sophie wasn't even dating anyone seriously. I said, "What happened to keeping the wedding small?" He paused. Then he said, "It got a little bigger than we planned. Sarah's family has expectations. Her dad's inviting a lot of business contact. We need to match that energy, you know? We can't look cheap in front of these people." I said, "And you need my retirement money to avoid looking cheap." He said, "Dad, don't say it like that. It's not about looking cheap. It's about starting our marriage off right, making the right impressions, building relationships that could help my career." I said, "I see." He said, "So you understand?" I said, "I understand that you want my money." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not fair, Dad." I said, "What's not fair?" He said, "You're making this sound like we're using you. We're your kids. We're family. This is what family does. They help each other." I said, "I asked for help 4 months ago. You said no." He sighed. I could hear the frustration in it. He said, "That was different. That was a short-term cash flow thing. This is about long-term investment in our futures." I said, "My mortgage was a short-term cash flow thing?" He said, "You know what I mean, Dad. You handled it. You figured it out. You always do. That's what makes you such a great dad. You're resourceful." I said, "I'm resourceful because I have to be, because I don't have anyone to fall back on." He said, "That's not true. You have us." I said, "Do I?" He didn't answer that. Instead, he said, "Look, just think about it, okay? We're not trying to pressure you. We're just asking you to consider it. We're asking you to help us the way you've always helped us." I said, "I'll think about it." He said, "Don't think too long, okay? We need to put deposits down. The venue wants 50% by next month." I hung up and sat in my living room, staring at the wall with my one good eye. I kept replaying his words. "You handled it. You figured it out. You always do." Like it was easy. Like I hadn't spent months eating nothing but pasta and canned soup to pay off that loan. Like I hadn't gone back to work before I was ready and nearly gotten myself killed. Like it didn't matter. Sophie called a week after that. She was crying before I even said hello. She said, "Dad, I don't know what to do. My business isn't taking off like I thought. I'm behind on rent. My credit cards are maxed out. I might have to move back home." I said, "You can always come back, Sophie. You know that." She said, "I don't want to. I'm 27. I should be able to make this work. But I just need a little help. Just enough to get me through the next few months." Rebecca said you were thinking about helping us out. I said, "She told you that?" Sophie said, "She said you were considering it, giving us each some money from your retirement." Dad, that would change everything for me. I could pay off my credit cards, get a better computer, actually invest in my business. I could hire a marketing person. I could finally make this work. Beta, I said, "What kind of business are you running?" She said, "Graphic design, logo design, branding, social media graphics. I have a few clients, but it's not enough. I need to scale up." I said, "How many clients do you have?" She paused. 3 regular ones, a few one-off projects here and there. I said, "And how much are you making?" She said, Some months are better than others. Last month I made about $800. I said, Sophie, you can't live on $800 a month. She said, I know, that's why I need help. If I had the money to invest in my business, I could get more clients. I could make this work. I said, or you could get a stable job and do freelance on the side. She was quiet. Then she said, you sound like everyone else. I said, what does that mean? She said, everyone tells me to give up, to get a real job, to stop chasing my dreams. I thought you believed in me. I said, I do believe in you, but I also want you to be realistic. She said, realistic? Dad, you're the one who taught me to follow my dreams. You're the one who told me I could do anything. I said, I didn't tell you to go broke doing it? She started crying harder. I can't believe you're saying this to me. I thought you'd understand. I thought you'd help me. I said, Sophie, when I needed $5,000, you told me you didn't have it. The crying stopped. There was silence on the line. Then she said, that was different. I said, how? She said, I really didn't have it, Dad. I was barely getting by. I still am. I said, and you think I'm not barely getting by? She said, you have a retirement fund. That's different than day-to-day money. I said, it's money I saved so I wouldn't be a burden on anyone when I'm too old to work. She said, you'd never be a burden. We'd take care of you. I didn't say anything. I just sat there, holding the phone, thinking about the $5,000. She said, Dad, please, I'm really struggling. I'm scared. I don't know what I'm going to do. I said, I'll think about it. She said, everyone keeps saying that. You'll think about it. But no one actually helps. I said, Sophie, I've been helping you your whole life. She said, and I appreciate that. I do, but I need help now. Doesn't that matter? I said, of course it matters. She said, then help me. I said, I need time to think. She hung up without saying goodbye. Rebecca called me on my birthday every year. She sent a card at Christmas. She invited me to dinner maybe twice a year, always at a restaurant where we split the bill. When I asked about her life, she gave me surface-level updates. Work was stressful. Her husband was fine. They were still looking at houses. That was it. I'd try to dig deeper. I'd ask what she was working on, what houses she'd seen, how Mark was doing at his job. She'd give short answers and then change the subject, usually to something about me. How's work, Dad? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you eating well? I thought she cared. Now I wondered if she was just being polite, checking boxes, doing what a good daughter was supposed to do. Daniel called more often, but the calls were short. 5, maybe 10 minutes. He'd ask how I was. I'd say fine, he'd say great, and then he'd have to go. He was always about to go into a meeting, or getting on a call, or meeting someone for lunch. He invited me to things occasionally, a barbecue at his apartment, a work event where he needed a +1 because Sarah was out of town, a basketball game he had extra tickets for. I always said yes. I was grateful to be included, but I noticed he never asked about my life. Not really. He'd say, how's work? And I'd start to answer, and he'd get distracted by his phone. He'd say, sorry, Dad, what were you saying? And I'd say, nothing important, and he'd say, cool, cool. Sophie was the one I heard from most. She called when she needed advice, or when she was upset, or when she wanted to vent about a friend or a job or a client who didn't appreciate her work. I listened. I gave her what support I could. I told her she was talented, that she'd figure it out, that I believed in her. She told me I was the only one who really understood her. She said Rebecca was too judgmental and Daniel was too busy to care. She said, you're the only one who actually listens, Dad. I felt special when she said that. I felt needed. But when I went blind, none of them came to visit. Not once. Rebecca sent a text. So sorry, Dad. Let me know if you need anything. I didn't respond. What would I have said? I need you to visit me? I need you to care? Daniel called and said, that's rough, Dad. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. I said, I'm trying. He said, good, good. Listen, I've got to run, but let me know if you need anything. I said, okay. I never called him back. Sophie said, oh my God, Dad, that's awful. I'll try to come see you soon. I said, that would be nice. She never did. A week later, she called me crying about a client who didn't pay her. I listened for 45 minutes while she vented. She never asked how my eye was healing. I told myself they were busy. They had their own lives. I didn't want to be the kind of father who demanded attention. I didn't want to be needy. But when Rebecca called asking for $80,000, something shifted in me. I started paying attention, really paying attention, and I realized they'd been treating me like an ATM for years. It's frustrating. Everything's overpriced. I said, what kind of budget are you working with? She said, we're looking in the $450 to $500 range. I did the math in my head. They wanted $26,000 from me to help buy a house that cost $500,000. That meant they were putting down 10% at most. Probably less if they were paying for a wedding too. I said, that's a lot of house. She said, it's really not, Dad. Not in this market. You should see the places we've looked at. They're tiny, or they need a ton of work. We want something we can actually live in. I said, makes sense. She said, so have you thought more about what we talked about? I said, I have. She sounded excited. And? I said, I'm still thinking. Her tone changed. She said, Dad, It's been 3 weeks. How much more thinking do you need to do? I said, it's a big decision, Rebecca. I'm trying to be careful. She said, careful? Dad, we're your children. It's not like we're strangers asking you for money. I said, I know that. She said, then what's the problem? I said, there's no problem. I just need more time. She sighed. I could hear the frustration. She said, fine, but we can't wait forever. We need to know soon. I said, how soon? She said, the end of the month. Daniel's venue needs an answer, and we need to know if we can make an offer on a house. I said, that's 2 weeks. She said, I know, but that's the reality, Dad. We need to move forward with our lives. I hung up feeling sick. I needed to look her in the eye and understand who she'd become. She answered the door in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, holding a coffee mug. She looked surprised. Dad, what are you doing here? I said. I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by. She hesitated. I could see her deciding whether to let me in or make an excuse. Finally, she stepped aside. Okay, come in. The apartment was nice. Nicer than I expected. The furniture looked new. Expensive. There was a big TV mounted on the wall. Must have been 60 inches. I saw a stack of mail on the counter, including a brochure for a resort in Mexico and a catalog from some high-end furniture store. We sat in the living room. She didn't offer me coffee. She didn't ask if I wanted water. She just sat across from me, holding her mug, waiting for me to explain why I was there. I said, how's work going? She said, it's fine. Busy. I said, what are you working on? She said, just campaigns, client stuff. Nothing exciting. I said, do you like it? She looked at me like I'd asked a strange question. It's a job, Dad. It pays well. I nodded. I looked around the apartment again. I said, this is a nice place. She said, thanks. We like it. I said, how much is the rent? She frowned. Why? I said, just curious. She said, $2,800 a month. I did the math. That was more than my mortgage. I said, that's expensive. She said, it's the city, Dad. Everything's expensive. I said, how much do you and Mark make together? Her frown deepened. Why are you asking me this? I said, I'm trying to understand your situation. She said, our situation is fine. We make good money. We just don't have a lot of savings because we've been paying off student loans and trying to build our lives. I said, how much do you have saved? She set down her coffee mug. She said, Dad, I'm not going to sit here and let you interrogate me about our finances. I said, I'm not interrogating you. I'm asking questions. She said, it feels like interrogation. Why do you need to know how much we make and how much we've saved? I said, because you're asking me for $26,000. I think I have a right to know if you actually need it. Her face changed. She looked offended. She said, of course we need it. Why would we ask if we didn't need it? I said, you're paying $2,800 a month for rent. You're planning a trip to Mexico. You have a TV that probably cost $2,000. You're looking at houses that cost $500,000. That doesn't sound like someone who's struggling. She stood up. She said, I can't believe this. You're seriously judging us for having nice things? I said, I'm not judging you. I'm trying to understand why you need my retirement money when you seem to be doing fine. She said, we're not doing fine, Dad. We're in debt. We're stressed. We're trying to build a future. Just because we have a nice apartment doesn't mean we're rich. I said, when I needed $5,000, you told me you couldn't help because you were saving for a house. She said, we are. I said, but you went to Mexico. She stared at me. Then she said, that was a wedding. We didn't have a choice. I said, you always have a choice. She crossed her arms. She said, you know what, Dad? This isn't fair. You're holding one thing over our heads like we committed some terrible crime. We couldn't help you. We're sorry. But that doesn't mean you get to punish us forever. I said, I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. She said, from what? From your own children? I said, from making a mistake I can't recover from. She said, wow, okay. I see how it is. I said, how is it? She said, you're keeping score. After everything we've been through, after everything you've done for us, you're actually keeping score. I stood up. I said, I'm not keeping score, Rebecca. I'm just noticing a pattern. She said, what pattern? I said, you ask me for help when you need it. But when I need help, you're not there. She said, that's not true. I said, when did you visit me after my surgery? She didn't answer. I said, when did you call to check on me? She said, I texted you. I said, you sent flowers and a card. She said, what did you want me to do, Dad? Drop everything and move in with you? I said, I wanted you to visit. Once. Just once. She looked away. She said, I was busy. I said, too busy to see your father after he went blind? She said, don't be dramatic. You didn't go blind. You lost vision in one eye. I stared at her. That's when I knew. I said, I'm going to go. She said, fine, go. I walked to the door. Before I opened it, I turned back. I said, I'm not giving you the money, Rebecca. She said, I figured. I said, I hope the house hunt goes well. She didn't respond. I left. My daughter thought I was being dramatic because I'd lost vision in one eye. My daughter thought I was keeping score because I remembered being abandoned. My daughter thought I owed her $26,000 because I was her father. I went inside and poured myself a drink. I don't drink much, but I needed something to take the edge off. I sat on my couch and I thought about all the years I'd spent raising her, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the times I'd gone without so she could have what she needed, and I realized she didn't remember any of it. Or if she did, she thought it was just what fathers were supposed to do. Maybe she was right. Maybe that is what fathers are supposed to do. But children are supposed to do something too. They're supposed to care. They're supposed to show up. They're supposed to remember. My phone rang. It was Daniel. I didn't answer. He called again. I let it go to voicemail. He texted, "Dad, Rebecca called me. We need to talk." I turned off my phone. We talked about work, about his fiancée Sarah, about the wedding plan. He told me they'd found a venue they love. It was a barn that had been converted into an event space. Rustic but elegant, he said. Sarah was excited. He didn't mention the money for 20 minutes. He was waiting, testing the waters. Finally, he said, "So Rebecca's pretty upset." I said, "I know." He said, "She said you accused her of not caring about you." I said, "I didn't accuse her of anything. I told her the truth." He said, "Dad, that's not fair. We all care about you. Just because we couldn't help with the loan doesn't mean we don't love you." I said, "I didn't say you don't love me." He said, "Then what's the problem?" I said, "The problem is you're asking me to give you money I need, and you're acting like I owe it to you." He set down his beer. He said, "We're not acting like you owe us anything. We're asking for help. There's a difference." I said, "When I asked for help, you said no." He said, "That was $5,000, Dad. This is different." I said, "How is it different?" He said, "Because this is about investing in our futures. That was just, I don't know, a short-term thing. You handled it." I looked at him, really looked at him. He was 31 years old. He had a good job, a nice apartment, a fiancée from a wealthy family. He was wearing a watch that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. I said, "Do you know what I did to pay that loan back?" He shook his head. I said, "I went back to work early, before my doctor cleared me. I worked 10-hour shifts in a warehouse with half my vision gone. I fell twice. I almost got hit by a forklift. I did that because I didn't have another option." He looked uncomfortable. He said, "I didn't know it was that bad." I said, "You didn't ask." He said, "I asked how you were doing. You said you were fine." I said, "What else was I supposed to say?" He didn't answer. I said, "You want to know the truth, Daniel? I wasn't fine. I was terrified. I was in pain. I was exhausted. And I was alone because none of you came to see me. None of you checked on me. You sent texts. You left voicemails. But you didn't show up." He said, "Dad, I said, "I'm not done. You're asking me for $26,000 so you can have a fancy wedding, so you can impress Sarah's family, so you can start your marriage off right. But when I needed $5,000 just to keep my house, you told me you were stretched thin." He stood up. He said, "That's not fair." I said, "What's not fair?" He said, "You're guilt-tripping me. You're making me feel like a terrible person because I couldn't give you money one time." I said, "It's not about the money, Daniel. It's about the fact that you think I'm an ATM. You think I'm here to fund your life. And when I can't, or when I won't, I'm the bad guy." He said, "That's not true." I said, "Isn't it? When's the last time you called me just to talk? When's the last time you visited me when you didn't need something?" He didn't answer. I said, "I've spent 30 years being your father. I've given you everything I have, and the one time I needed you, you weren't there. So no, Daniel, I'm not giving you $26,000 for your wedding. You'll have to figure it out, just like I did." He said, "You're making a mistake, Dad." I said, "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." He said, "You're going to regret this." I said, "I doubt it." He grabbed his jacket. He said, "I hope you're happy." I said, "I'm not, but I'm done letting you make me feel guilty for taking care of myself." He left. He slammed the door on his way out. I sat on my couch and finished my beer. I felt terrible, but I also felt something else. I felt free. Sophie came by a few days later. She didn't call first either. She just showed up, holding a grocery bag. She said, "I brought dinner. I thought we could talk." I let her in. She unpacked the bag in the kitchen. Rotisserie chicken, salad, bread. She moved around my kitchen like she still lived there, pulling out plates, pouring water. It reminded me of when she was younger, when she'd help me make dinner and we'd talk about her day. We sat down to eat. She asked about my eye, about work. She seemed genuinely interested. It felt nice. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe Sophie was different. Maybe she really did care. Then she said, "Dad, I feel like things are weird between us, between all of us." I said, "They are." She said, "I don't want it to be like this. You're my dad. I love you." I said, "I love you too, Sophie." "Min," she said, "then can we just move past this? Rebecca and Daniel are upset. I'm upset. I don't want our family to fall apart over money." I said, "It's not about the money." She said, "Then what's it about?" I said, "It's about the fact that you all think I owe you something. And when I needed you, you weren't there." She looked down at her plate. She said, "I know I couldn't help with the loan. I'm sorry. I really didn't have the money." I said, but now you need $80,000 to start a business that's already failing. She flinched. She said, "It's not failing." I said, "Sophie, you're making $800 a month. You're maxing out credit cards. You're behind on rent. That's not a business. That's a hobby you can't afford." Her eyes filled with tears. She said, "That's mean, Dad." I said, "It's not mean. It's true." She said, "You don't believe in me." I said, "I do believe in you, but I don't believe in this. You're drowning, and instead of getting a life raft, you're asking me to jump in with you." She said, "That's not what I'm doing." I said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm asking my father for help." I thought that's what you wanted. You always said I could come to you with anything. I said, "And you can, but I'm not going to enable you to destroy yourself financially." She said, "You think I'm destroying myself?" I said, "I think you're making bad decisions because you're afraid to admit this isn't working." She stood up. She was crying. She said, "I can't believe you're saying this to me." I said, "Someone needs to say it." She said, "You're supposed to support me. You're supposed to be on my side." I said, "I am on your side. That's why I'm telling you the truth." She said, "The truth? You want to know the truth? The truth is you're selfish. You spent our whole lives telling us we could do anything, and now that we're trying, you won't help us. You have the money, Dad. You could change our lives, but you won't, because you're keeping score, because you can't forgive us for one mistake." I said, "It wasn't one mistake, Sophie. It was a pattern. It's been a pattern for years, and I was too blind to see it." She said, "What pattern?" I said, "You call me when you need something, advice, money, emotional support, but when I needed you, you disappeared." She said, "That's not true." I said, "When did you visit me after my surgery?" She didn't answer. I said, "When did you call me to check on me?" She said, "I called you." I said, "Once. You called once, for 5 minutes." She said, "I was working 3 jobs, Dad." I said, "And I was recovering from surgery that left me blind in one eye. But somehow I was supposed to understand that you were too busy." She wiped her eyes. She said, "You're never going to forgive me, are you?" I said, "I forgive you, Sophie, but I'm not going to give you my retirement money." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I need it, because I worked my entire life to save it, and because I'm finally learning to take care of myself instead of everyone else." She grabbed her purse. She said, "I hope you're happy, Dad. I hope it's worth it. Losing all of us over money." I said, "I'm not losing you. You're choosing to leave." She said, "You're forcing us to leave." I said, "No, I'm just not funding your lives anymore. There's a difference." She walked out. She left the food on the table. I sat there alone, looking at the rotisserie chicken, and I cried. I sent him a message on his birthday. No response. I sent another message asking how the wedding planning was going. Nothing. Sophie sent one message that said, "I can't believe you're doing this to us." I didn't respond. I went to work. I came home. I lived my life. And slowly, very slowly, I realized something. I felt lighter. I didn't feel guilty anymore. I didn't feel like I was failing them. I didn't feel like I owed them anything. For the first time in 30 years, I was living for myself. I started going to a gym near my house. Nothing fancy, just a place with weights and treadmills. I went 3 times a week. I started eating better. I bought a cookbook and learned to make things that weren't pasta and canned soup. I joined a support group for people with vision loss. It met every Thursday evening at a community center. There were 8 of us. We talked about adapting to life with limited vision, about the frustrations and the small victories. One of the guys, Tom, had lost his left eye in a car accident 10 years ago. He was funny, self-deprecating. He made jokes about his depth perception. He said he'd learned to golf with one eye, which seemed impossible to me. After the 3rd meeting, he asked if I wanted to get coffee. We went to a diner down the street. We talked for 2 hours. He asked about my family. I told him everything. The surgery, the loan, the $80,000, the silence. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he nodded and said, "My kids did the same thing." I said, "Really?" He said, "Not exactly the same, but similar. After my accident, I needed help for a few months. I couldn't drive. I couldn't work. My son was living 2 towns over. He came to visit once in 3 months. My daughter lived across the country, so I didn't expect her to fly out. But she didn't call much either, mostly texts." I said, "That's awful." He said, "It was. But then I asked them for help moving into a smaller apartment. I couldn't afford my place anymore on disability. They both said they were too busy. My son said he had a work trip. My daughter said she couldn't get off work. So I hired movers and did it myself." I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be. It taught me something important." I said, "What?" He said, "They're adults now. They have their own lives, and I can't make them care about mine." I said, "But they're your kids." He said, "They are, and I love them, but I can't force them to love me back, not the way I need them to." I said, "So what did you do?" He said, "I let go. I stopped calling. I stopped texting. I stopped trying to be part of their life. And you know what happened?" I said, "What?" He said, "One of them came back, my son. It took him a year, but he called me one day and said he was sorry. He said he'd been selfish. He said he wanted to try again. So we did. We rebuilt our relationship. It's different now, smaller, but it's real. I said, and your daughter? He said, she sends a card at Christmas. That's it. And I'm okay with that. I had to be. I said, how did you get to okay? He said, I started living for myself. I stopped waiting for them to make me happy. I found new friends, new hobbies, new reasons to get up in the morning. It's not the life I thought I'd have, but it's a good life. I thought about that conversation a lot over the next few weeks. She said, is this Sophie's father? My heart stopped. I said, yes. She said, she's okay, but she was in a car accident. She's stable, but she asked us to call you. I drove to the hospital immediately. I didn't think. I just got in my car and drove. When I got there, Sophie was in a bed with a bandage on her forehead and a bruise on her arm. She looked small, fragile. When she saw me, she started crying. I sat down next to her. I held her hand. I said, what happened? She said, I fell asleep at the wheel. I've been working 3 jobs, Dad. I'm so tired all the time. I closed my eyes for a second. I said, you're okay now. She said, I'm not okay. I'm drowning. I can't keep doing this. I said, then stop. She said, I can't. I have bills. I have debt. I have to make this work. I said, why do you have to make it work alone? She said, because you won't help me. I said, I never said I wouldn't help you, Sophie. I said I wouldn't give you my retirement fund. She looked at me. She said, what's the difference? I said, the difference is, I'll help you find a way forward. I'll help you make a plan. I'll help you figure out what's realistic. But I won't give you money so you can keep pretending everything is fine when it's not. She cried harder. She said, I've been so stupid. I said, you're not stupid. You're scared, and you're trying to prove something that you don't need to prove. She said, I wanted to make you proud. I said, Sophie, I'm already proud of you, but I want you to be safe more than I want you to be successful. She said, I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't help you. I'm sorry I asked you for money. I'm sorry I was so selfish. I said, I forgive you. She said, just like that? I said, just like that. She said, what about Rebecca and Daniel? I said, what about them? She said, do you forgive them too? I said, I do, but they haven't asked for forgiveness. She said, they're stubborn. I said, so am I. She smiled a little. Then she said, can I come home? Just for a little while? I said, of course. She started sleeping through the night again. One evening, a few months after she moved in, we were sitting on the couch watching TV. She said, Dad, can I ask you something? I said, of course. She said, do you think Rebecca and Daniel will ever apologize? I said, I don't know. She said, does it bother you? I said, sometimes, but I'm learning to be okay with it. She said, how? I said, I'm learning that I can't control what they do. I can only control what I do, and I've decided to live my life in a way that makes me proud, whether they're part of it or not. She said, I'm not like them. I don't want to be like them. I said, you're not. She said, how do you know? I said, because you came back, because you admitted you were wrong, because you're trying to do better. She said, I'm going to keep trying. I said, that's all I can ask. I sent Christmas cards. I didn't get responses. It hurt. It still hurts sometimes, but I'm okay. I retired at 62. I had enough saved. Greg, my financial advisor, helped me make a plan. I downsized to a smaller place near the coast. It's quiet here, peaceful. I started volunteering at a community center, teaching basic budgeting classes to people who were struggling. I met more people like Tom, people who'd been through hard things and came out the other side. Sophie visited me once a month. We talked on the phone every week. She told me about her life, and I told her about mine. It was real. It was honest. It was enough. One day she called me and said, Dad, I got promoted. I said, that's wonderful. I'm proud of you. She said, I couldn't have done it without you. I said, yes, you could have, but I'm glad I could help. She said, do you ever regret it, saying no? I said, no. She said, even though you lost Rebecca and Daniel? I said, I didn't lose them, Sophie. They chose not to be here. There's a difference. She said, that's sad. I said, it is, but I'm not sad anymore. She said, why not? I said, because I found out who really loves me, and that's enough. I don't know if Rebecca and Daniel will ever come around. Maybe they will. Maybe they won't. But I know this. I did the right thing. I protected myself. I set a boundary. And I learned that sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for are the ones who will demand even more. I learned that love isn't just about giving. It's about mutual respect. It's about showing up. It's about remembering. And I learned that I deserve better than what they were willing to give me. I sit on my porch in the evenings now, looking at the ocean with my one good eye, and I feel free. I feel lighter than I have in years. I spent 30 years carrying the weight of their needs, their dreams, their expectations. And when I finally put it down, I discovered something. I'm stronger without it. I'm happier without it. I'm me without it. And that's worth more than $80,000. It's worth more than anything.